In the shadowed corners of a brutal slave world where men were treated as property and blood became entertainment, one name echoed like thunder through whispered fear and reluctant admiration. He was not born a warrior, he was forged by chains, by hunger, by hands that tried to break his spirit and failed every time. They called him a slave, but in the fighting pits he became something else entirely. A living force no man could conquer. Forced into the ring for the amusement of wealthy spectators, he stood against seasoned brawlers, ruthless enforcers, and men twice his size. Yet every time the dust settled, it was he who remained standing. 37 opponents entered the circle with confidence, arrogance, or desperation. 37 left defeated. Not once did he fall. Not once did he beg. Not once did he surrender. This is not just a tale of fists and fury, it is the story of a man stripped of freedom, who refused to let his soul be enslaved. A legend born in cruelty, shaped in silence, and remembered in defiance. The undefeated slave fighter who turned oppression into power and survival into an unbreakable legacy. He was not born into the ring, nor did he choose the path that would turn his body into spectacle and his pain into profit. Because from the moment he could walk, he understood that his life was never meant to belong to him, only to the hands that owned him, and the eyes that watched him with hunger for dominance and control. The first time they dragged him toward the fighting ground, his wrists bound raw with rope and his back stiff with fear, he did not know that this place would become his cage and his hell, a crude circle of dirt surrounded by shouting men who placed bets as casually as they laughed, men who saw broken noses and split lips as nothing more than evening amusement. The underground pit was hidden from the world, yet it thrived like a cruel heart pumping violence through the veins of the plantation economy, where enslaved men were chosen not for their strength alone but for the potential cruelty they could endure, selected like animals and stripped of identity to become instruments of sport. He was forced forward, barefoot on cold soil, his chest already marked with old scar, his eyes scanning faces that held no mercy, only curiosity and anticipation, and when he tried to resist the hands that pushed him inward, a whip snapped across his shoulders to remind him that resistance was a luxury he could not afford. They taught him quickly that the ring was not about skill first, but about survival, that every blow he received was a lesson in pain, and every moment he stayed on his feet bought him another night of breathing, another chance to see the dim light of dawn over the barrack. His opponent that first night was larger, heavier, already seasoned by previous matches, and the crowd roared as the two were forced to stand face to face, not as men but as opposing beasts expected to tear each other apart for the pleasure of strangers. He learned to move because he had to, dodge because the alternative was collapse, to strike because stillness meant surrender, and with each clash of bone and sweat he began to understand the savage rhythm of the ring, the way the world narrowed to clenched fists and blurred vision, to the sound of voices rising every time blood touched the ground. There were no rules that protected him, no bell to signal mercy, only the unspoken command that one man must fall before the other could leave. Night after night he was called back, sometimes with barely enough time to heal, sometimes still limping from the last beating, yet always dragged forward with the same expectation that he would either entertain or perish. The owners praised his endurance not as admiration but as calculation, recognizing in him a profitable tool, someone who could draw larger crowds, higher wagers, louder cheers, and so his forced participation became routine, his name spoken among overseers not as a man but as a reliable fighter. Around him, other enslaved men were chosen and discarded, some refusing and paying with their lives, some breaking after a few matches, their spirits crushed beneath the weight of humiliation and pain. He watched them disappear with a silent understanding that the same fate waited for him if he faltered even once. Every time he stepped into the ring, the air thick with smoke and sweat, he felt the invisible chains tighten not only around his body but around his future, as if the world beyond those bounds no longer existed for him. Yet amid the brutality, something inside him shifted, a quiet transformation born not from desire but from necessity, as his mind adapted to the role forced upon it, calculating movements, anticipating strikes, using the little strength he had to turn defense into reaction, reaction into instinct. He observed his opponents closely, the tremor in their stance, the stiffness in their shoulders, the hesitation in their eyes, and slowly, unconsciously, he began to fight not just to avoid death but to control the chaos that surrounded him. The crowd saw only the violence, the spectacle of a slave swinging his fists in desperation, but within him every match became a silent battle for dignity, an unspoken refusal to collapse under the gaze of those who sought only his destruction. Even as they cheered for blood, even as they laughed when bones cracked, he endured with a cold focus, knowing that each moment he remained standing defied the very purpose of the system trying to erase. His forced entrance into the underground fighting world stripped away all illusion of humanity from those who controlled it, revealing a reality where suffering was packaged as sport and slavery reached its most savage form, reducing a living soul to entertainment for men who would return to their comfortable lives without carrying a single bruise. And as he stood again and again in that unforgiving circle, his body scarred and his breath heavy, the realization settled deeper that this ring was not simply a place of combat, but a stage designed to remind him exactly where the world believed he belonged, beneath boots, beneath laughter, beneath the casual cruelty of those who saw his pain as a performance rather than a tragedy unfolding in silence, while he waited for the next command to step forward into the dirt and face another man equally trapped in the same nightmare, another life forced to collide with his own for the sake of spectacle and profit, another reminder that survival was not a choice, but a demand placed upon him by a world that refused to see him as anything more than a fighter in chains caught in an endless cycle of forced violence and obedience, where every breath, every movement, every heartbeat echoed the simple truth that his existence had been reduced to endurance alone. While the shadows pressed closer and the crowds grew louder, hungry once more for the sight of him pushed back into the ring to prove again that he could still stand, could still take the blows, still live through another night in a world that fed on his suffering and called it entertainment, while his spirit moved in quiet defiance beneath the weight of a role he never chose but was compelled to live, beneath the watchful eyes of those who waited eagerly for the next fight to begin. Bare feet touched the soil once more as the circle closed around him and the noise rose like thunder, demanding more blood, more struggle, more pain, as he readied himself for what waited ahead, knowing there was no escape, only motion, only resistance, only the raw instinct to keep standing as long as his breath filled his chest and the world refused to let him be anything other than a body meant to endure in the ring of cruelty and forced survival, where every second became a test and every blow, another reminder of the brutal reality he could not leave behind yet could not allow to break completely, leaving him always moving, always bracing, always preparing for the next impact that would come without warning from a life that never offered mercy and never permitted rest, while the underground world continued to feed upon his strength and his silence, and his unwilling refusal to fall into nothingness for the pleasure of those who believed they owned not only his body but the very meaning of his existence, as he remained trapped within this relentless cycle of forced combat and survival that demanded everything from him and offered nothing in return except the hollow chance to survive one more night and face the same darkness again. Word of his endurance did not remain confined to the dirt ring where he was first broken and remade, because whispers travel fast in places where cruelty becomes currency and spectacle becomes power, and soon his name moved beyond the crude fences into the mouths of overseers, gamblers and plantation owners, who spoke of him with a mix of fascination and calculation, as if he were no longer a man but a phenomenon made of muscle, scars and defiance. They began to measure other fighters against him, calling him unbeatable, unshakable, a living weapon forged by suffering, and with every new opponent who stepped into the circle and failed to bring him down, his reputation grew larger, darker, more feared. Men traveled from neighboring lands to witness the slave who would not fall, bringing coins to place bets and eyes eager for proof of the stories they had heard spoken in hushed tone, stories of a fighter who absorbed punishment like storm-soaked earth, and rose again with a silence that unsettled even the cruelest spectator. Each time he was summoned, the crowd swelled, the noise thickened, the air heavy with expectation, because they did not come merely to see a fight, they came to see the undefeated one, the living legend born from chains who had become the central figure of their twisted entertainment. His owners leaned into this growing fame, parading him not as a person, but as a prized attraction, a guarantee of profit and heightened excitement, knowing that his presence alone doubled the stakes and sharpened the hunger of the crowd. They spoke proudly of him to visitors as if claiming victory in his suffering, pointing toward the scars on his body as proof of their investment and control, praising his strength while ignoring the silent cost paid in every bruise, every gasp for breath. Every night he lay aching on a hard floor waiting for another command to rise. Opponents approached him with different eyes now, some filled with arrogance, determined to be the man who finally defeated him, others shadowed by fear already planted by the stories that followed his name. He saw it in the way their stances shifted, in the way their bravado faltered the moment their gaze met his own, as if they sensed he was no longer merely reacting but had become something calculated, something hardened by experience beyond their understanding. Even the overseers began to adjust their behavior, treating him not with kindness but with a cautious respect born from recognition of his value, ensuring he was fed just enough, tended just enough, preserved not for his sake but for the spectacle he provided. In their eyes, his undefeated status was an asset, a symbol of dominance that reflected well on the system that crushed him, proof that their brutal world could produce champions without ever allowing them dignity. The crowd responded to his every movement now, roaring his name, stomping their feet when he stepped forward, leaning closer when his fists rose, as if the very sight of him fighting renewed their sense of power and control. They called him unstoppable, yet never questioned why he had to be, never considered what it meant that a man had been forced into becoming a warrior for their pleasure, their voices carrying his legend outward while his reality remained confined to the same unforgiving circle of dirt and blood. With each match completed and each opponent defeated, his legend thickened like a shadow stretching across the plantations, shaping conversations, fueling rumors, and creating a reputation that transformed him from just another enslaved fighter into the centerpiece of a grim mythology. Some claimed he felt no pain, others insisted he welcomed the violence, as if the world needed to believe he was something other than human to justify what they watched happen to him. Yet behind the reputation, behind the cheers, behind the fearful respect of men who would never truly free him, he remained trapped in the same cycle, rising again simply because he had no alternative, stepping forward again because refusal was death, moving through the acclaim like a ghost walking through noise, carrying the weight of every expectation placed on his scarred shoulder. The fame they gave him was not freedom but another chain, binding him tighter to the role they had carved into his existence. When new fighters arrived, strong men from distant lands forced into the same cruel contest, they were warned of him before they ever saw his face, told that he was the one to beat, the one to fear, the standard by which their worth would be measured. Some trained harder at the thought of facing him, others prepared themselves for humiliation, yet all stepped into the ring knowing they were confronting more than a man, they were confronting a reputation built on blood and endurance. He felt the shift in every match, the tension thick in the air before the first blow, the way the crowd leaned forward with breath held as if expecting to witness history yet again. Every strike he delivered, every step he took, fed the legend further, turned him into a symbol of brutality and resilience intertwined, a figure both glorified and condemned in the same breath. The system that enslaved him celebrated his undefeated status as if it were proof of their superiority, ignoring the irony that his strength was born from the very cruelty they imposed, that his resilience was an unintended rebellion woven into their design. They spoke of him as a marvel, a beast, a prize, anything but a man, anything but a soul caged within flesh that had learned to endure beyond natural limits. As his reputation expanded, so did the expectations, the demand for greater fights, stronger opponents, bloodier displays, as if each victory demanded a more dramatic spectacle to keep the crowd satisfied. And so the cycle deepened, his legend growing louder while his world remained just as small, just as suffocating, a spotlight shining brightly on his forced greatness while the darkness of his confinement never lifted, leaving him standing once more at the center of a hype he never sought, a fame he never desired, surrounded by voices that praised his strength without ever understanding the silence that lived within him as he prepared again and again to meet the next challenge that would feed the myth of the undefeated slave fighter, and deepen the cruel admiration that followed his name, wherever the whispers traveled and the stories stretched further into the night, while the ring awaited its most feared and celebrated figure to step forward once more into the harsh glow of attention and expectation that never freed him, but only bound him tighter to the role of an invincible spectacle in a world that refused to let him be anything else. 37 times the circle closed around him and 37 men stepped forward believing they would be the one to end what had become an unstoppable sequence of domination and survival, each challenger carrying his own mixture of desperation, pride, and fear. And with every new face the crowd leaned in closer, driven by the same question that hung heavy in the air like smoke. Would this finally be the man who brought the undefeated fighter down? He watched them all with the same unreadable calm, seeing not enemies chosen by fate but reflections of his own captivity, men forced into combat for reasons they never chose, yet required to clash as if their suffering were sport and their pain a currency passed from one hand to another. The first of those 37 came with reckless confidence, swinging wildly, fueled by arrogance and the hope of quick glory, yet the ring devoured such recklessness without mercy and taught him a lesson before the crowd's cheers faded. The second arrived with caution, circling carefully, trying to read his movements like a puzzle, but strategy crumbled beneath pressure, and again he remained standing. Each victory did not feel like triumph but like another weight added to his existence, another mark on a chain forged from expectations and fear. Word of each defeat spread rapidly, painting an image of invincibility that only sharpened the tension with each subsequent match. And soon the men who faced him came prepared not just to fight but to challenge a legend,
to carve their names into a story that had already taken on a life of its own. Some tried brute strength, believing power alone could overwhelm him. Others relied on speed, trying to exhaust him into collapse. And a few stepped forward with the haunted look of men who already knew the outcome yet had no choice but to perform their part in the cycle. He became methodical, adapting to every style, every stance, every desperate attempt to master him, not because he sought domination but because survival demanded adaptation, demanded precision, demanded an ability to read the smallest signs like tension in a shoulder or hesitation in breathing. Each opponent left something behind, a lesson, a scar, a reminder that every victory was paid for with pieces of himself he could never reclaim. The crowd loved the pattern, the consistency of his dominance, the certainty that when his name was called, they would witness another defeat, another man falling before the slave who refused to fall. They counted his victories like milestones in a cruel celebration, boasting about the number as if it were a record in a grand competition, never once considering that these numbers represented broken bodies, shattered pride and relentless violence disguised as entertainment. As the count rose, so too did the stakes, the pressure, the intensity with which each match was approached, for now he was not just fighting men, he was defending a title thrust upon him, a reputation that others desperately wanted to claim by being the one to finally break it. Each time he entered the ring, the silence before the first blow grew heavier, as if the entire world paused to witness whether perfection could be shattered at last. Some opponents arrived with hatred burning in their eyes, resenting the way his name overshadowed theirs. Others carried a strange respect, acknowledging the silent struggle they shared, even as they prepared to strike each other down. Yet despite the difference in emotion, the pattern remained the same, and 37 times the outcome wrote itself in the dust before their feet. With every victory, the space between him and ordinary men widened until he no longer seemed like one of them, until the concept of defeat that defined human struggle felt foreign to the world that had built around him. He became an anomaly in a system designed to crush, a figure who endured beyond normal measure, and that endurance was twisted into legend rather than recognized as a scream surviving within silence. He did not celebrate when another man fell. There was no joy in his breathing when the crowd roared louder, no pride in the way his name echoed across the broken walls of the underground pit. All there was the awareness that another day had been conquered, another night survived, another attempt to destroy him turned away, and still the chains around his life remained just as tight as they had been before the first fight ever began. The number 37 became more than just a record. It became a symbol used by his captors to elevate their cruelty into myth, proof they could boast about their undefeated slave fighter as though his strength somehow belonged to them, as if the victories were shared instead of stolen. They spoke it with pride, with wonder, with admiration twisted into ownership, repeating it through crowded rooms and whispered conversations like a tale meant to inspire excitement rather than understanding. Each man he faced entered the ring hoping to change the narrative, but each walked away with the same realization that this fight was never about personal glory, only about the machinery of oppression that demanded blood and obedience in equal measure. He remained standing not because the ring honored him, but because he would not allow himself to become another quick story of defeat in a world that profited from their destruction. 37 battles formed a chain of moments, where he defied the inevitable, where survival outweighed exhaustion, where instinct conquered fear, where the body pushed beyond what it was ever meant to endure, and with every match that ended without his legend tightened its grip on the world around him, turning his existence into a spectacle that both mesmerized and dehumanized, a symbol of unmatched resilience, forced into glory by a system that refused to let him ever truly rest. While the count continued to define him and the people hushed could not look away from the living proof that he would not be broken, no matter how many men stood before him waiting for their turn to try and take away what remained of his strength and deny him the one title he never asked for but carried as a burden heavier than any chain. Undefeated slave fighter whose victories echoed louder than the silence that lived behind his eyes, as the cycle repeated and the ring claimed yet another man beneath the weight of his unyielding survival, while the crowd marked another number and waited for the next challenger to enter their cruel arena, and test whether the impossible could finally happen and whether the legend could finally fall in a world that demanded endings but never offered mercy. Long after the echoes of fists and shouts faded from the hidden pit, long after the dust settled on the blood-stained ground where his legend was carved, his name continued to move through the world like a quiet storm, whispered with awe and disbelief by those who never saw him fight but felt the weight of his story. To some he became a myth too powerful to ignore, a figure whose existence challenged the very idea of weakness imposed upon enslaved men, while to others he was a symbol too uncomfortable to understand, because in his survival lay the truth of how cruelty could never fully erase the human will. The people who spoke of him rarely understood the depth of what his undefeated status truly meant, for they saw only the surface of dominance and strength, never the years of forced obedience, never the silence that followed the cheers, never the nights broken by exhaustion and quiet reflection. Yet even through incomplete understanding, his story shaped the way others saw resistance, turning him into a silent emblem of endurance in a world that thrived on suppressing it. Among the enslaved, his name carried a different weight, not as entertainment but as a reminder that power could exist even within chains, that the body could be controlled but the spirit could still carve its own defiance in small stubborn ways. They spoke of him as proof that surrender was not inevitable, that even in the most brutal circumstances, a man could remain unbroken in ways that could not be measured by scars alone. To the oppressors he became a convenient legend, a story repurposed to support their twisted narrative by portraying him as an exception instead of questioning the system that created his suffering. They used his undefeated status as boast, as spectacle, as proof of their so-called dominion, never acknowledging that every victory he claimed existed in spite of them, not because of them. Over time, the ring that forged him into a feared figure became more than just a place of violence. It became a symbol itself, representing the brutal world that reduced life to performance and pain to profit. And within that symbol his existence stood as a contradiction, a man who endured where the system expected submission, who remained standing where it demanded collapse. Stories of his fights traveled further than the ground he ever walked, stretching across whispers told by firelight, passed through generations as caution and inspiration intertwined. Some details grew exaggerated, some softened by time, yet at the center remained the undeniable truth of a man who refused to fall, a life that bent without breaking. People spoke of him not just as a fighter but as a presence, a shadow that lingered long after physical chains had rusted away, reminding the world that even in the darkest corners of history, there were those who resisted simply by continuing to exist. The legend became less about the violence and more about the meaning carved through it, the idea that survival itself could be a form of rebellion. He was remembered in fragments, in hushed conversations, in the way elders described a time when strength meant more than muscle and endurance meant more than breath. His name became intertwined with the idea of silent resistance, a story not written in books but carried in memories and murmured narratives that refused to let him vanish into obscurity. Even as time moved forward and the world changed, the image of the undefeated slave fighter remained etched into the unseen corners of collective memory, a reminder of what human persistence looks like when pressed into unimaginable cruelty. He became an echo carried forward by those who recognized that his story was not just about combat but about spirit, not just about survival but about the refusal to be erased. And though the world that once forced him into the ring may have tried to define him only by his ability to endure pain, his legacy grew beyond their control, transforming from spectacle into symbol, from forced fighter into a quiet icon of unyielding strength. The chains that bound his body could not cage the meaning of what he represented, and the system that sought to break him could not erase the message his survival carried. His story continued to live not in the cheers of cruel crowds, but in the silent recognition of those who understood the depth of his struggle, those who saw his undefeated record not as mere dominance but as a testament to the power of a soul, refusing to disappear. The legend endured, evolving into something larger than the ring, larger than the violence, larger than the history that tried to consume him. Each retelling added another layer, another interpretation, another understanding of what it meant to stand when the world demanded collapse. And within those layers his presence remained steady, constant, a figure who stood as proof that even the harshest systems fail to completely extinguish the fire of human resilience. He became a whisper that outlived the pits, a voice that echoed through time without ever speaking, a symbol shaped by suffering but defined by resistance. And even as generations shifted, and the world moved further away from the era that created him, his legend remained grounded in the basic, undeniable truth that he was never beaten, never silenced, never. And the meaning of his endurance continued to ripple outward in ways that could not be controlled or diminished by the same forces that once sought to reduce him to nothing more than a body in a ring. His legacy lived on not through celebration of violence, but through recognition of strength, not through the memory of blood, but through the understanding of perseverance, not through the cruelty that forged him but through the spirit that carried him beyond it. And in that ongoing remembrance the essence of who he was continued to move quietly through history like an unbroken current, reminding every listener that oppression may shape a life, but it does not always define the soul, and his story continued to breathe within the collective memory as a symbol of defiance. It refused to fade into silence. As time moved forward and the echoes of his name remained alive in the shadows of history and the quiet spaces between remembered suffering and untamed resilience, where his undefeated legacy still waited to be spoken again and again by those who refused to let his struggle be forgotten, or diminished or turned into nothing more than a footnote of spectacle in a world that finally began to understand the true weight of what his unbroken spirit represented in the face of overwhelming cruelty that sought forever to silence him but never succeeded in doing so, and never could, as long as his story continued to live on in the minds of those who carried it forward. Another era of understanding and remembrance without ever allowing the meaning to end or fade away.
And when the dust of history finally settles and the echoes of cruelty grow silent, his story remains standing like an unshattered monument against a broken past, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness there are those who refuse to be erased. He was forged in chains, tested in blood, and condemned by a world that sought to own his very existence. Yet he rose above every blow, every humiliation, every attempt to grind him into nothing. His undefeated name does not belong to the ring, nor to the hands that forced him there. It belongs to the defiance that lived in his breath, the courage that refused surrender, the spirit that would not bow. He was never just a fighter, never merely a spectacle, but a living testament to the raw power of endurance, proof that even when freedom is stolen, dignity can still stand unbroken. In that truth his legacy does not end. It roars through time like a final unyielding declaration that no chain is strong enough to silence a soul that chooses to survive and rise beyond the cruelty meant to destroy it.